I'm Ellis Martin. Join me for a conversation with Craig Shesky, the CFO of The Metals Company, trading on the NASDAQ as TMC. The Metals Company is an explorer of lower-impact battery metals from seafloor polymetallic nodules on a dual mission. One, to supply metals for the clean energy transition with the least possible negative environmental and social impact. And two, to accelerate the transition to a circular metal economy. The Metals Company, through its subsidiaries, holds exploration and commercial rights to 3 polymetallic nodule contract areas in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone of the Pacific Ocean, regulated by the International Seabed Authority, sponsored by the governments of Nauru, Kiribati, and the Kingdom of Tonga. Go to the company's website, metals.co. Once again, it's me, Ellis Martin, Money Talk Radio in Miami, Florida. We are here for Minds and Money Miami, and I'm sitting with my friend and sponsor of the program, Craig Shesky, with the Metals Company. Craig, nice to see you again. How are you?
Doing very well, Ellis. Thanks again for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you.
What's happening in the world of deep sea mining for nickel nodules?
It's been a very busy last 6 months, and really a lot of the geopolitical environment has been changing over the last 6 months, and really we think moving in favor of the commercialization of this resource. In fact, you may have seen earlier in January, Norway opened up their territorial waters for deep sea exploration and pending environmental work exploitation. So there are credible industrial countries that are now throwing their weight behind deep sea resources. Late last year, China had made announcements that they are looking to move quickly ahead in deep sea resource extraction. In fact, the Washington Post came out with a deep dive article on what Chinese plans are in this industry. And that's actually been very important on the geopolitical front because it's drawn out a response from the United States. In fact, you had 31 congresspeople late last year write to the Pentagon demanding a plan on how the U.S. can process and refine polymetallic nodules. And that actually culminated in the National Defense Authorization Act in late 2023, which basically lays out a map for how the Pentagon plans to catch up in this race of processing and refining of nodules. That report from the Pentagon is due to the U.S. House Armed Services Committee in March of 2024. So right around the corner, we expect more good news on the political front. And don't forget that we're also applicants for the Department of Defense DPA Title III grant program. So the political winds are blowing in favor of the extraction of this resource. And it's a really great time to be bringing online what mining.com ranks as the #1 and #2 largest nickel project on the planet.
From what I understand, compared to other forms of extraction, which really means out of the ground, deep sea nodule mining for nickel is the cleanest form, the most responsible form of collection of nickel than anything else. In fact, Indonesia, Russia, China is considered dirty nickel, and we can have that in the U.S. if everything's permitted for it, and it's not being permitted right now.
You're absolutely right, and what's very interesting about nickel supply, it's increasingly coming from a few names. As you mentioned, Indonesia, Russia, and really the Indonesian supply is funded by China. So very soon you're going to have 2/3 of the nickel market coming from Indonesian supply, and Russia controls about 20% of the Class 1 nickel market. So really you're going to have over 3/4 of global nickel supply coming from what could be perceived as adversaries to certain Western countries. So what we would produce in terms of the metal from these polymetallic nodules would have a lower CO2 footprint than traditional land-based sources. There's no deforestation. There's hardly any solid waste. There's no tailings. There aren't any local communities to move. Importantly, there are land-based nickel projects that are responsible and that can be done right, but a lot of it is supply in Canada or Australia that frankly is now struggling. So given Indonesia has been flooding the market with relatively low cost and high environmental impact nickel, it's creating an opportunity for a new source of supply like the nodules coming from TMC. We can compete at the current nickel prices. We can compete at nickel prices far lower. So this is a large potential source of supply that isn't already controlled by China or Russian-funded sources.
So let me understand this. You can compete economically with Russia, China, and Indonesia.
Yes, we can.
Lay that out a little bit if you wouldn't mind.
Well, really, it all comes down to the unique attributes of this resource. These nodules have high grades of nickel, copper, cobalt, and manganese. And if you actually roll those metals into a nickel equivalent, you're talking about over 3% nickel resource. That compares to many other undeveloped nickel projects in Canada or Australia that might be 0.2% or 0.3%. So it's just a naturally higher grade of this material. Said another way, you're moving less material to get the same amount of metal. Importantly, too, these nodules are not buried. They're sitting on top of the seafloor in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone of the Pacific Ocean. So really, it's more about collecting these nodules than mining. There isn't any digging or blasting blasting or drilling. So the process to collect them, along with the fact that the grade of the material is naturally high, leads us to a position where we can be economic really in almost any price environment that we can envision.
So not only are you providing a clean source of energy for the EV sector, for the battery metal sector, you are doing it in a environmentally responsible way. Now, having said that, there might be some that don't quite understand mining like we do that would say, well, what are you disturbing under the sea?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and a lot of people have that question, and I understand a lot of people hear deep sea mining and they have a certain knee-jerk reaction. That's why it's important to actually look at science-based evidence, and that's what the regulator, the International Seabed Authority, is going to be basing their decision on, and we think allowing us to move forward to begin commercial production around the end of 2025. So that science-based evidence is starting to come out, and the potential impacts of collecting these nodules are frankly quite a bit lower than what some of the speculation has been to date. Not all science is created equal, and when it comes to speculation about what these impacts could be, that speculation has to give way to actual in-field observed data. And now that we've done our collection test, now that the Belgians did theirs, the Germans as well, a lot of this data is starting to come out showing that the potential impacts, including the seafloor plume, are far smaller than initially speculated. So while that's taken its time to trickle its way through the media, the International Seabed Authority, and importantly their Legal and Technical Commission, who will be reviewing our application, they are well aware of this new data that's coming out. We present it to them regularly during their ISA meetings. There's another one coming up this March in Jamaica, and all of this information to us is pointing in the right direction, showing that these nodules can be collected at the lowest possible planetary impact.
How far away are you from offering nickel to the supply chain?
We would expect to be in production around the end of 2025. So post-processing, and keep in mind we have a binding agreement with a facility in Japan through Pacific Metals to process these nodules in terms of onshore capex at no cost to TMC. It would just be a tolling fee. So really processing the nodules at existing facilities. So that material would be available on the supply chains in 2026.
Let's spell out the potential investment opportunity. Underline the word potential investment opportunity for those here in Florida listening to the show on the radio here and our audience around the country and around the world.
Certainly. Well, what we are developing is a very high grade, very economic, very large resource. In fact, again, what mining.com has ranked as the #1 and #2 largest undeveloped nickel project in the world. And yet, our market cap right now is still under $400 million. And the net present value of the underlying asset, our first block alone, Nori Area D, has a net present value, as calculated by AMC Consultants, of $7 billion. And that was done in 2021. But this is a resource that, talk about the whole resource, not just our first project, which is less than a quarter of our total resource. The NPV is measured in the tens of billions. But just on that first block alone, we're trading around 5% of the underlying net present value of that asset. Typically, a nickel or copper developer at this stage of pre-production might trade between 30 and 40% of NPV. So really, there is a major valuation disconnect between the quality and size of this resource versus our market cap, which we don't think is effectively discounting all of the good news that has occurred over the last few years and all of the de-risking that has occurred to prove the collection technology. So importantly, a lot of people focus on the regulator, the International Seabed Authority, and we think they're making great progress on finalizing the rules that allow this industry to go forward. In fact, the Secretary General of the ISA, Michael Lodge, was on CNBC earlier this week, and he was asked, is this industry going to happen? And his response was that it seems to be inevitable. And we would agree with that. And it's really based on confidence that we're seeing on the environmental side to show that the impacts here can be managed and mitigated and kept under control.
I imagine you've had some positive response from some of the family offices that have visited you here at this conference, correct?
Yes, absolutely. We've had a packed schedule of meetings at this conference. We've had a few other side events presenting to really several dozen high net worth individuals and family offices. Of course, we have new initiations of coverage, including Cantor Fitzgerald, who initiated on us in late 2023. And that's helpful for a lot of our institutional fund potential investors. But we want to make sure that this story can be well told to retail, high net worths, family offices, and institutions. So that's why we are going to leave no stone unturned and continue spreading the word about this very special resource.
Well, you've done that very proficiently, very nicely on this program, Craig. Thank you so much for joining me at Minds and Money, Money Talk Radio here in Miami.
It's a pleasure, Ellis, anytime.
I've been speaking with Craig Shesky, the CFO of the Metals Company, trading on the NASDAQ as TMC. Go to the company's website, metals.co. I'm Ellis Martin.
This is South Florida's Money Talk Radio.